Icarus, the man who flew too close to the sun. No matter which era, a lot of writers like to reference this story in their writing, and it seems Classroom of the Elite is not an exception. Not only referencing, this story of Icarus becomes a direct quote back in Volume 3 of the first year arc, symbolizing Ayanokoji who ignores his father's warning, and his desire to fly closer to the sun. However, before we talk about Ayanokoji, let's start with the story of Icarus himself, because believe it or not, I found a lot of interesting similarities between Icarus' story and Ayanokoji's circumstances. For starters, even though this story is titled Icarus, most of the story actually revolves around his father, Daedalus. Daedalus is a very talented craftsman. He worked under King Minos, and one of his best inventions is the labyrinth that was used to trap the Minotaur. However, King Minos was furious when Daedalus helped the hero Theseus escape from the labyrinth and kill the Minotaur, so he imprisoned Daedalus and his son on top of the tower. If Ayanokoji is the Icarus, then Daedalus is undoubtedly Atsuomi. Atsuomi worked following the order from Naoe, and he built the White Room also under his order, but when the political scheme changed sides, Naoe decided to abandon him and left Atsuomi as a political outcast. The similarity of Daedalus and Atsuomi is not that much, but at the end of the story, both of them refuse to die accepting the cruel fate and fight for their freedom. After that, the story shifted to Icarus, which surprisingly has a ton of similarity with how Ayanokoji chose to enroll at ANHS. After they got imprisoned, Daedalus gathered a lot of feathers from the top of the tower and glued them together with wax. He manages to create two pairs of wings for him and his son, but before they fly away from the tower, Daedalus gives Icarus a warning. Fly too close to the sun and the wax will melt, but fly too low and the feathers will get wet with seawater. To be able to fly safely, they need to keep their height exactly in the middle, so they would be able to safely escape from King Minos. The term exactly in the middle must have reminded us of Ayanokoji in the first volume, where he scored exactly 50 in the exam, and decided to simply become an ordinary student who didn't want to stand out or be involved in trouble. Even though Ayanokoji experienced a lot of bothersome events, he managed to stay in the middle, at least in his first year. However, just like Icarus, Ayanokoji decides to aim a little higher, flapping his wings closer to the sun. Back in Volume 3 of the first year arc, Chabashira mentioned the story of Icarus to Ayanokoji. Just like Icarus who fell into the sea and died after his wings burned, Ayanokoji who ignores his father's order will also lose his freedom. If we force to draw a connection, Ayanokoji who seeks the balance between the four classes ended up losing his wings, and while it's not yet happening, the chance of Ayanokoji failing to reach what he wanted is never zero. The wings that Ayanokoji lost could represent a lot of things, but I believe the wings in this story refer to Horikita and the rest of his friends from Class D. For the sake of his goal, Ayanokoji ended up cutting his tie with Karizawa, with Ayanokoji's group, and finally with Horikita. Even though he worked hard to gather them and glued them with wax, he burned it for the sake of his son. The question about whether Ayanokoji will fall to the sea or not will need to wait until the end of the third year. But no matter how Ayanokoji ends up later, the main focus of the Icarus story was never about the sun, but the freedom to reach for his goal. By enrolling at ANHS, it seems like Ayanokoji escapes from his father's hand for 3 years of freedom, but unfortunately, even his enrollment is part of Atsuomi's plan. Back in Volume 3, Chabashira also mentions another representation of the Icarus story. At the end, Icarus was only following his father's order. His father was the one who planted the idea about freedom in his head, which means he didn't fly with his own desire. This line didn't make too much sense when it first aired, but now after Volume 0 was released, it's sad to see that this line from Chabashira actually foreshadows the truth about Ayanokoji. Volume 0 confirmed that Ayanokoji was never free from his father's grasp, because even his enrollment in ANHS was already planned by Atsuomi. To make it worse, the idea of experiencing normal life and going to high school was also planted in his mind by the butler Matsuo, who is the extension of Atsuomi himself. At the end, just like Icarus, Ayanokoji only walked the path that was prepared by his father, because both Icarus and Ayanokoji were never free from the beginning. However, the relationship between Ayanokoji and Icarus is nothing more than a reference. It's possible for Ayanokoji to meet the same end as Icarus, but from the current development of the story, it becomes harder to see how much Atsuomi has an influence on Ayanokoji's school life. Icarus met his tragic end because he didn't listen to Daedalus, but for Ayanokoji, Atsuomi's warning to withdraw from school was nothing more than a bluff. If Atsuomi always planned for Ayanokoji to stay at ANHS, that means Ayanokoji never disobeyed his father's order, which means there is actually no boundary of what he could or couldn't do. That fact alone separates Ayanokoji from the bond that holds Icarus from flying higher. In fact, there are two moments in the story where their difference were written in underline. The first one happened in Volume 3 during Chabashira's monologue, where she said Ayanokoji didn't have Icarus' bravery and arrogance, and the second one happened during his talk with Tsukishiro, where he said that even Frog in the Wheel knows how vast and high the sky is. The biggest difference between Ayanokoji and Icarus is how calculative Ayanokoji can be. He understands what he is trying to reach, and he doesn't merely rely on a single tool without a safety net. It's hard to think that kind of person would fail to reach his goal, but Ayanokoji's goal is on the same level of impossible as Icarus, who tried to reach the sun. At the end, both of them try to reach something beyond their understanding. Even without their father's guidance, both of them would eventually meet the inevitable fate for a mortal who tries to touch the realm of the god. I know it sounds really exaggerated for Ayanokoji, but following the latest volume development, I start to abandon the hope that Ayanokoji could reach his happy ending. The last thing that might be important to look up is how the story ended for Daedalus. In Icarus' story, Daedalus starts his new life with regret as he sees his son fall into the ocean. Even though he manages to escape from the tower, he pays the price that might not be a worthy exchange for his freedom. However, it's hard to see Atsuomi showing that kind of regret. He only thinks of Ayanokoji as a tool, and even if he loses Ayanokoji in the process, as long as he gets what he wanted, Ayanokoji's life is just a small sacrifice. However, it will be satisfying to see Atsuomi end up in regret if Ayanokoji actually leaves him. Either Ayanokoji will betray him and join the other side, or simply run away far from his reach. Just like Daedalus, Atsuomi will get what he wanted, but that will be the end of him without anyone who will continue his legacy. Anyway, Icarus' story indeed sounds like a tragic series, but fortunately, there are a few other ways to see how the story ended. For example, while it's undeniable that Icarus fell and died reaching the sun, it doesn't change the fact that he did feel the warmth of the sun. Even though his wings burned, he flew as high as he could in search of his freedom. In some other version of Icarus' story, it is also stated that Icarus didn't scream when he fell. He didn't regret his choice, but he laughed because he knew that his fall meant he once soared to the sky, even if it cost him his life. By falling from the sky, Icarus managed to live life to the fullest, and achieve something extraordinary that no one else ever reached. Icarus' story is not about his failure, but about his way of life that tries to find some meaning in this life. Just like Ayanokoji, Icarus stopped playing it safe in the middle, and tried to find some meaning in his little time having the wings. That's why even though they are completely different people with different circumstances, you can see how deeply Icarus' story put a meaning in Ayanokoji's existence. He only had 3 years of freedom, so Ayanokoji stopped playing in the middle, and tried to see if aiming really high could actually give him something worth fighting for. He might end up losing his freedom, losing every person who is close to him, or maybe even losing his own life, but just like Icarus laughing at the end of his life, maybe Ayanokoji would also find something meaningful. At the end, we still didn't know how far Icarus' story would influence Ayanokoji's fate. Maybe he will follow the same fate as Icarus, or maybe there will be some unexpected way that will lead him to discover a surprise ending. No matter how he will end, he did try to reach the sun, and its warmth will always be with him for the rest of his life.